So that was Kurt Vonnegut, and we wanted that little video presentation to do two things. First, to just introduce you to the persona of Kurt Vonnegut, who is as cranky and funny and sarcastic when he talks as he is when he writes, and who's just a funny-looking little man too. And really, and I almost brought in to show you today all of my Vonnegut novels. I have a stack about this high. Kurt Vonnegut got me through my first year of college. I've reread his books many, many times, and really one of my favorite authors. But we also wanted to show you a little bit about Vonnegut struggling with the shape of narrative, because that clip was, in a sense, it was also satire, saying that the plot of stories can be fed into computers. And you'll see why that is satirical when we talk about Slaughterhouse-Five, which really is a plot that would be very difficult to plot on his axis.
So let's back up, because you used a technical term. What is satire?
Satire is formally defined as a combination of criticism and humor that is directed at a social problem. Mm-hmm. And it goes back, actually the word satire means a bowl of mixed fruit. It goes back to the Greek, goes back to Aristophanes, with the great Roman satirists, Lucian and Horace and Juvenal. The century that I studied in graduate school, the 18th century, is a century of Jonathan Swift and Alexander Pope and John Dryden, and these were the great satirists.
So who are satirists that they might know today? Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart, Stephen Colbert, the people who do South Park, the people who do The Simpsons. This is what social satire looks like today. And Vonnegut, in my opinion, was the great literary satirist of the 20th century. So here we have a story, and let's talk about chapter 1 a little bit. Because in a lot of books, you'll have the author talking to you in a preface or a foreword or something where the author is saying, this is why I wrote this book. Vonnegut does this, but he puts it in chapter 1, not in any kind of author's preface, and that means that it becomes part of the novel. So what Vonnegut does is create another character in his novel named Kurt Vonnegut. And that Vonnegut pops in every once in a while. Every once in a while, he will put himself in the story and say, well, I was there when Billy Pilgrim was going through this. So this Vonnegut is a much closer representative of the author, Kurt Vonnegut, but it is still part of the novel. And in this novel, the first part of the novel is the novelist telling us that he has, for some time, been struggling to write a novel about his experiences in Dresden. And he's a fairly established novelist by this time. I think this is his 5th novel. So he's written Player Piano and Mother Night and God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater and Breakfast of Champions. He's already written some of his, kind of really important books. And he wants to write a book about Dresden because he was there.
And he's wanted to write one for years.
Since he got back. And he tells us on page 2, well, it's page 2 of my book. That's your British version, right?
This is my British version.
You bought that
which
in
I bought for £9.75 and right on the plane.
Really? Mm-hmm. And it probably spells realize and color wrong, right?
It does.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, in my American version, on page 2, sort of towards the bottom of the page, I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I had seen. And I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. And we'll talk in the next video a little bit about exactly what happened at Dresden. But it was the largest single loss of life in World War II, wasn't it? In over just one incident.
In the European
theater. Yeah, it was a horrific thing. The Allies bombed this German city of Dresden. Vonnegut was a prisoner of war in Dresden, and he survived the bombing because they held the prisoners in the basement of a slaughterhouse, Slaughterhouse 5, and that's where the novel gets its title. This is not a novel about slaughterhouses, except that Slaughterhouse 5 happens to have been where Vonnegut survived this great massive cataclysm. And he tells us, and how much we believe this. Remember, he's almost telling us he wants to write a memoir.
Yeah.
Right? Yep. I want to just explain what happened accurately and truthfully. I want it to be a memoirist.
Yeah, he actually uses, I think, the word report, right? Which is kind of an interesting word. Report, in some ways, he wants to be a journalist.
Yeah.
Or a memoirist, either way, but to report the true and accurate facts of what he saw. And he thinks this will be easy.
Yeah.
And I would love to see him and Manchester have a conversation about how they both, what each of them thought they would be doing when they started their books. Because I think Manchester also thought it would be easy. And it turns out for him not to have been very easy. But he doesn't get to that point until very late in the book.
Yeah.
Here he says, Vonnegut says at the very beginning, right, page 2, this is hard.
Yeah. It's not even hard. It's impossible.
Yeah.
He says he can't do it. You know, he's a respected, well-published, reasonably famous novelist at that point. He can't tell the story from his experience. What gets in his way? Why can't he just explain what he saw?
Well, one of the things he talks about is the complexity, right? And so he's got this wall where he plots out plots. And so you've seen this video where he lays out some of the standard plots. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I'm not a literature person. I know people who do literary studies outline the 7 or 8 or 12 or whatever standard plots there are. But one of the things he talks about is that this, I think about it as a wiring diagram, which is a military term, quickly becomes so complicated that it's impossible. But I'm not sure really complexity is the only thing, right? It's trying to figure out how to draw the truth out of the story that's most significant for him.
He even uses, here on page 6, he tries to draw this plot out. I used my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. One end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, the other end was the end, and then there was all that middle part, which was the middle, and the blue line met the red line, and then the yellow line, and the yellow line was dead, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange cross-hatching, and all the lines that were still alive, passed through it and came out on the other side. So it doesn't...
Yeah, but he doesn't stop that section there, right? Because then he then moves to say the end, where all the lines stop, was a beet field on the Elbe outside of Halle. Right? And he goes on to tell this story about the exchange of prisoners. And you think the end must have some sort of meaning, right? If you're going to tell a story about it, you need to be able to come up with some moral or something. And yet, all he can come up with is an idiotic Englishman who had lost all his teeth somewhere with a souvenir in his bag, a plaster model of the Eiffel Tower, and the last line is, "There's a smashing thing," he said. And there's no meaning, right? You can't construe. And he's at least I think he's being very intentional about demonstrating here that the end is an end which is absurd.
Yeah.
And how do you create meaning out of the absurd?
And so there, as I see it, there's 2 problems here. One is his memory of the firebombing of Dresden was sitting in a dark basement in a slaughterhouse. Yeah. And there's all of this geopolitical stuff that he had absolutely no access to because he was a private. And so when he tells his experience of the bombing of Dresden, I was sitting in a basement scared to death, and a whole bunch of other people were sitting with me, and that's it.
Yeah, and this is Manchester's point, which you read last time, where he says quite specifically, I didn't recognize Sugarloaf Hill because from my perspective, I only saw a tiny slice of Sugarloaf Hill in quick peeks as I got stuck up my head above the foxhole or around the rock. And I never saw the whole hill. And that's in some sense what he's saying here, right? I saw a basement in a slaughterhouse, and that's my experience of the bombing. And it doesn't match most people's experience.
And it doesn't tell the story of the bombing.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It doesn't give you any of the context. And so his just reporting as an eyewitness isn't a story.
Yeah.
Isn't a novel. It's just a rather mundane thing.
Yeah.
Even though this was a tremendous geopolitical cataclysm. And the other problem, And this is what his friend's wife tells him when she's so upset that he's going to write this novel. And she says, you shouldn't write this novel. And she's angry. And this is on my page 18. You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs. I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. But you're not going to write it that way, are you? This wasn't a question. It was an accusation. I don't know, I said. Well, I know, she said. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in the movies by Frank Sinatra and John Wayne or some of those other glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men, and war will look just wonderful, so we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies like the babies upstairs. So he promises her. And again, this is part of the novel, and he's certainly working it here. But he promises not to make it a war where there are big heroes, and he's going to call it the Children's Crusade, which is in fact the subtitle of the novel. You have to look at the title page to see the subtitle. But Slaughterhouse-Five, or The Children's Crusade, A Duty Dance with Death.
And
So-
he does that before, right? It's like writing. He's got that little conversation earlier in this chapter about how writing an anti-war novel is kind of like writing an anti-glacier novel.
Yeah.
They'll still be there whether you write the novel or not, and nothing's going to change.
Yeah. So what can you do? What can a novel do? And that's and
Well, go ahead.
let's see. And this is a very, very prominent anti-war novel, among many other things. But what can a novel do?
A novel can illuminate.
Right.
So if part of the human experience is about sharing experiences with others, a novel can do that, at least to some degree, right? To bring you into somebody else's experience and give you some glimpse of the truth of their truth.
And there are, throughout here, there are several other proto-novelists that we encounter. One of them is Roland Weary, who is Billy Pilgrim, and look at the names here, because the names are very important, because a pilgrim is somebody who goes somewhere to find religious significance, and Billy Pilgrim may or may not fit that description. And then Roland Weary, who's the guy that he meets here in the first chapter, he's going to write the truth of the war in a novel. So he's kind of an incipient novelist. And the novel he's going to write, 53, is exactly the novel that Vonnegut's friend's wife was afraid somebody would write. Weary's version of the true war story went like this. There was a big German attack, and Weary and his anti-tank buddies fought like hell until everybody was killed but Weary. So it goes. And then Weary tied in with 2 scouts, and they became close friends immediately, and they dedicated to fight their way back to their own lines. They were going to travel fast. They were damned if they'd surrender. They shook hands all around. They called themselves the Three Musketeers. And, well, first of all, So It Goes.
Yeah, that pops up almost every page.
Yeah, every time somebody dies, he says, so it goes. And that's one of the sort of the jokes of the novel. And we'll see when he goes to Trafalgar why he says that. But, do pay attention to that. But also, Weary, who is exactly the child, the baby that Billy Pilgrim is, has already created this novel in his head.
Which is the novel that societies have traditionally created about war.
Yeah.
Which is the novel that people aspired to be characters in. This is what Manchester wanted to be, is this person in this novel that Weary is creating. And is precisely the novel that Vonnegut is questioning.
And we'll talk about this in the next video, too. One of the mechanisms he uses to question these things is Kilgore Trout, who is in almost every Vonnegut novel in some form. And he's this horrible novelist with brilliant plots that can be summarized in one paragraph. And Vonnegut frequently throws out a Kilgore Trout novel to make a point. And he doesn't, all he uses is a one paragraph summary because he's not a very good novelist.
So what does Vonnegut get from placing all of this material in that first chapter in the body of the novel as opposed to a preface or an author's note or something?
For one thing, he reduces its reliability and our expectations of its truthfulness. If he'd have made this an author's preface, we would have been encouraged to read that like Vonnegut himself talking to us. By putting it in the first chapter, it is part of the novel, and the I, narrator, is another character in the novel. And that means we shouldn't read that as absolute truth either, because that's part of the story. And I think he's acknowledging that. He's saying that even as I try, this is the chapter, the first and the last chapters are where he tries to tell the story straight. But even then, that's fiction. And I think putting it inside of the novel as chapters in the novel emphasizes that even that memory is a fiction. So what else do you make of this first chapter, the second chapter, the chapter where Billy Pilgrim is introduced?
This is an odd way of starting a chapter, right? Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time.
Yeah.
Which is not a phrase you're ever going to hear in a war novel. Or at least you don't expect to hear that, right?
Yeah.
In some ways, this signals the genre right away. So what genre is this?
Well, Vonnegut frequently used science fiction elements in his stories. This is not even the first appearance of the Tralfamadorians. They appear in his second novel, Sirens of Titan, which is also a wonderful novel. But in that novel, turns out the Tralfamadorians have been manipulating Earth's history for thousands of years in order to send a message to another advanced species. And the message, it turns out, is hello. And that's all that Earth's history means.
Absurdity.
Absurdity.
Mm-hmm.
So he uses science fiction techniques.
Mm-hmm.
He's not really a science fiction novelist. He is a satirical novelist who frequently uses things like time travel and aliens and other science fiction-y techniques in order to tell a story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what he does here. And the first thing he tells us is that the main character is living his life out of chronology. The same way that the narrative is out of chronology. And these things are very, very intended to go together. Mm-hmm. We don't have a traditional linear narrative here like the ones that Vonnegut was plotting out, because the main character doesn't experience time that way.
Mm-hmm. And again, this matches Manchester, right? Because his very explicit statement that I cannot anymore construct a chronological narrative. I don't remember my life that way. Yeah. And this is juxtaposed, right? Because that first section, that very depending how you count 4 or 5 paragraphs of chapter 2, is this coming unstuck in time. But right after that, you have what in other novels would be a very traditional beginning, right? Billy was born in 1922. Right, and so he warns you right up front that it's going to look for the moment like a traditional narrative, but it's not. Be careful.
And really, I think you said it exactly right. We experience life linearly, but we don't remember life linearly. Our memories don't work in any sort of progression. They go from point to point as we're jogged to think of certain things. So the narrative here is much more accurately descriptive of the way that we remember things. And I think that's an important point for the whole course.
Yes. Yeah, and you might so is this a novel about Dresden or a novel about how we remember Dresden?
I think it can't be anything but a novel about how we remember Dresden. And and we don't even see Dresden in.
Yeah, I will say. So I read this for the first time the last time we taught this course, and I didn't know anything about Vonnegut, to be honest, or Slaughterhouse-Five. He's an American author, and I tend to focus on Europe and Africa. And I kept waiting for Dresden to show up, and I got 2/3, 3/4 of the way through the book, and I'm like, well, did I just misunderstand what this book was about? Is this false advertising? Because it is kind of represented. If you ask people what Slaughterhouse-Five was about, they'll say Dresden.
Mm-hmm. And there's probably like 4 pages
Yeah.
about the bombing of Dresden in the whole novel.
Mm-hmm. Everything
Everything else is some lead up to Dresden, and also the strange science fiction plot.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is probably the only novel about the firebombing of Dresden where part of it takes place on the planet of Tralfamadore
in a zoo.
in a zoo,
Yeah.
with Montana Wild Hat.
Mm-hmm.
So we're setting up that narrative. Now, this broken narrative is something that came about in the early part of the 20th century. If you read Faulkner, if you read Virginia Woolf or James Joyce, they have non-linear narratives where the narrative does not progress.
Mm-hmm.
It's broken up. Vonnegut uses that kind of modernist narrative, but he gives the scientific explanation for it, the science fiction explanation for it. My narrative is not going to cohere together because my character's life does not cohere together. My character lives life the way that all of us remember things. So Billy Pilgrim really is simply his way of being in the world is more memory than fact.
Now, so let's kind of pause here just for a moment as a historian. Recognize that from at the very beginning of the course, we talked to you about how we were intentionally using great books,
Yes.
right, which are written not by definition, but it often means there's that the authors of these great books are people who have an awareness of literature, who participate in this broader discussion about what literature
Right.
should be and how it should be shaped and how it relates to the various traditions and books relate to each other. And in some ways, this is a conversation across this course between people who are thinking about how to remember a combat. Now, that's really important. Recognize that a lot of the books you're going to see in Barnes & Noble are written by people who don't participate in this broader discussion, and that explains some of the distinction between the kind of, so just as an example, there's generally speaking 3 classic memoirs of World War II in the Pacific, one of which you read, Goodbye Darkness, written by a journalist who writes books. The other 2, one of them is by a guy named Robert Leckie. The other is by a guy named E.B. Sledge called With the Old Breed. These people are not participating in this literary discussion. They write what you would recognize as kind of a classic memoir, starting from the beginning, ending at the end, and trying to fit all of the things they remembered into some kind of common plot. Right. So one thing for you to think about as we work here is, what do you gain by having this kind of meta discussion? And do you, if any, lose anything, if at all, by having that awareness?
And that's a really good point, because Vonnegut, the author, in chapter 1, he tells us that's what he was trying to write.
Exactly.
And he couldn't, because he knew that wouldn't be true.
Yeah.
So in order to get around the fact that he couldn't write a traditional realistic narrative and tell the truth, he's going to tell us about time-hopping characters and space aliens and all of this fantastic science fiction stuff, because in his estimation, that gets to the truth of the story.
And I wonder, I don't know if this is true, I haven't thought much about it, but it seems to me, and I'm thinking here again about the Sledge and Leckie memoirs, it seems to me somewhat easier to write a traditional kind of narrative when the meaning is already established outside of it, right? Because they are very clearly participating in what they see as a good war for a good mission, and it is, of course, costly, but it is worth the cost because of what they do, and so they can create a narrative. They can fit their life into that narrative that's already established. Whereas Manchester, because of this kind of attachment to the Marine Corps that he finds betrays him and so on, can't see himself fitting quite into that narrative, so he has to craft meaning for himself.
Well, let's stop here for our first lecture and finish the book, because there's a lot of stuff we can't talk about till you finish this book. And we will be back soon with the second part of this discussion, where we'll focus on Dresden, and Dr. McFall will explain a little bit more about what happened at Dresden, and then we'll talk about making sense of it. Okay.